Good afternoon. Welcome to the Schemmel Forum. We like to start on time, you know that. It's a great pleasure to introduce Lynne Hartnett to you today to speak on a subject that I have often found puzzling and intriguing. I have had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Hartnett discuss Russian history before, and as well as Russian culture, and immediately invited her to share her wisdom on the subject with the Schemmel Forum. When I described to her the vitality and curiosity of our learning community, she immediately accepted the invitation. Dr. Hartnett is an associate professor of history at Villanova University, where she teaches courses on all facets of Russian history, as well as on the social, political, and intellectual history of modern Europe. She earned her Ph.D. at Boston College. Her research focuses on the study of the Russian revolutionary movement of the 19th and 20th centuries. She's the director of Villanova's graduate program in history and the president of the Sigma of Pennsylvania chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. Dr. Hartnett notes, as you've seen on the blurb in our brochure, that from the earliest recorded history of the Russian state, its own countrymen have sought to understand what it means to be Russian. I was frankly relieved when I spoke to her to learn that it wasn't just naive Americans like me who didn't understand Russia, but it was true of Russians as well. I assure you that her insights will help you on that front, as it did me. Please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra, for this, for the wonderful introduction and for inviting me here to this wonderful forum. It is a delight to be here, and as Sandra said, I really am excited by the vitality and intellectual curiosity that you all bring. I also have to thank Maury Myers for being the one who initially introduced me to Sandra. So, and I'd like to thank Allison Morrison for her lovely accommodations that she's provided for me moving on. So it's been a delight to be here, and I hope I can come back sometime. So Russia, right? For many years, when I was teaching my courses after I got my Ph.D., I felt like I started every semester trying to convince my students that Russia mattered, that Russia was still important, because after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so many of my students and so many, I think, Americans thought that Russia was now insignificant, right? That it didn't matter, that it wasn't important in global politics, and that we really didn't need to care about it. Because after more than a half a century of Russia being a superpower and determining much of the world's geopolitical twists and turns, in 1991, this country that was 1/6 of the world's landmass, that had nuclear weapons, whose military had stayed loyal to it, dissolved with merely a whimper, right? And so people thought that we had moved into this post-Russian world. And as a matter of fact, in 2012, in the presidential debate between now Senator Mitt Romney, who was then the Republican nominee for the presidency, when he debated President Barack Obama, Mitt Romney was asked what he considered to be the world's greatest geopolitical threat, or what he considered to be the United States' the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States. And Mitt Romney said he considered it to be Russia. And President Obama, who had not had a great first debate, used this as a way to kind of turn the tide on Mitt Romney. And he had a great line, and he jokingly said, Governor, the 1980s have called and would like their foreign policy back, right? This idea that Mitt Romney was almost laughable for thinking that, that Russia was a geopolitical threat. I don't think that I have to tell you now that Russia matters, right? I don't have to tell my students, I don't have to make the plea every semester to convince them that Russia matters. If you open the newspaper, even if you don't open the newspaper, if you look on the front page, or you look at CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, you will see signs of Russia's import and significance. Russia does indeed matter. And, you know, if we ever wondered if Russia was going to go silently into that good night, Vladimir Putin has announced to the world in many ways that they're back. And so Russia is significant. Now, Russia in 2019 seems to arouse anxiety and fears in many liberal democratic countries. And I think deservedly so. At the same time, he arouses this almost unending or seemingly unending admiration among his compatriots. And after more than a decade in the 1990s, where Russia's foreign policy seemed almost impotent, the tentacles of Putin's Russia now reach around the world from everywhere from Ukraine to Syria, to the democratic, elections in some of the democratic countries around the world. And so as a result, we look at Putin now and Putin's Russia, and we see this man as a master manipulator. One of the comments that so many people make is that there are some in American politics now who are playing checkers, and Putin is playing chess. And I think there is some validity to seeing Putin as a chess player. And I would say he is a bit of a master manipulator. He's good at what he does. And part of that is because he's been trained. The picture I have up here now just came out last spring. It was discovered in Germany in archives, and this is Vladimir Putin when he had a little bit more hair and fewer wrinkles. When this was his ID when he worked as a KGB officer in Dresden, in Germany. Putin learned what it meant to be operating in foreign countries at a pivotal time, and he learned how to do it pretty well. Because he is seen as this master manipulator, there's a lot of fears and anxiety about Putin because he revels in secrecy. For many years, Russians themselves wondered about things like Putin's marital status, Putin's children, how many he had, where they were. There were rumors that Putin's daughters were going to school in the United States. Nobody was really sure about where things stood. And the reason was he wanted it this way. This idea of being secretive helped his brand, and it helped him carve out the idea of himself in the way that he wanted to market it. So here we see some very interesting images of Vladimir Putin riding both bareback and shirtless on a horse, standing next to the Siberian tiger that he has, allegedly quelled. I mean, he's developed this impression and as being this very macho president of a revived and resurgent Russia, and that is important to him. This, in and of itself, harkens back to earlier times. Russian leaders for centuries have seen the ability to develop a mystique about themselves, about their power, about their rule, by being removed from the populace, by being removed from prying eyes, either of their compatriots or by foreigners. And this was a tendency that was embraced not just by Russian leaders, but by absolute monarchs well back in the medieval times into the early modern Europe. So there is this anxiety that he revels in and he thrives on. But what I would say to you is that I don't think we're as clueless I don't think we need to be as clueless about what Putin wants and what Putin wants for Russia as we may fear that we have to be. And one of the reasons is because even if American diplomats and politicians don't fully appreciate the role that Russian history plays in world politics and in Putin's agenda, Vladimir Putin does. History matters to Putin. Russia's history matters to Putin. And I would argue that if we look to see where Putin and Russia's agendas are moving forward, that it's just as useful for us to look at Russia's past to get a glimpse of where it might be going. A lot of people, when they think about Putin, they look back to his KGB roots, right? And they think, KGB officer, he must be the greatest communist that ever existed. And I can understand that. But what Putin really thrives on is patriotism. His sense of patriotism in Russia. His sense of what it means to have Russia be strong and capable and a power not just in its own country but around the world. The Soviet Union marshaled power and capabilities around the world. And certainly, while he was a child, and as he was an adolescent, and as he worked in the KGB's office in Dresden, Putin surely reveled in socialist ideology. But for him, he was able to divorce his priorities for Russia from this Marxist-Leninist perspective. Instead, Marxism-Leninism was more a vehicle for Russia's strength and power and stability around the world. And with that gone, with the Marxist-Leninist framework gone, Putin had no interest in hanging up Russia's hat in terms of being important and influential around the world. Instead, what he has done is he has purposefully and consciously reached back into history to find the source of Russian identity. Sandra mentioned that, I assured her that even Russians aren't sure what it means to be a Russian. And I did a whole series of lectures in which I talked about Russia's quest to find its own identity. This seems like a silly thing, right? It seems like how would Russians not know who they are? But it really was fundamental to Russian history. Pictured up on the screen is a map of Russia and Russia's expansion over several centuries. And if you look at the map, you'll see the kind of mustard colored up here. That was Russia in 1533. 1533 was the time that Ivan the Terrible, a ruler by the name of Ivan IV, came to power as a 3-year-old boy. And this was his territory. You can see it's relatively normal in scale from the size of a European country. But as the centuries wore on, as the decades wore on, and as one ruler followed the other, Russia expanded, and Russia's expansion came to be part of the very basis of what it meant to be Russian. This imperial agenda, this expansionary agenda, was critical. But from its very conception, from the very time that Russia developed as a power, it developed as an empire. Its empire didn't come centuries later, like in the case of England and the British Empire. Instead, from the time of Ivan the Terrible, Russia was an empire. Russia's first foray outside of traditionally ethnic Great Russian lands came as early as 1552. In 1552, Russia moved outside of what had been its base that had developed in and around Moscow into the city of Kazan. where one of our guests originated from. In the city of Kazan, Ivan the Terrible came into this city, which was along about several hundred miles from Moscow, and he conquered it in 1552. Why do I say this was the development of the Russian Empire? This was a land that was not inhabited by Russians, ethnic Russians. It was not a land where Christianity ruled. Instead, it was a large Muslim population. And from this point in Russian history, Ivan the Terrible, the ruler of Russia, realized that in order to maintain his power and stability as ruler and Russia's greatness, he had to rule this multinational, multi-ethnic state. How did he do it? He did it through the power of the Tsar. He did it through the power of the leader, the ruler, because in this multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state that was at the heart of Russia from the mid-16th century on, the Russian ruler was the cement that binded this territory together. In addition, he needed to find something, he and his successors needed to find something that would inspire devotion beyond just the Tsar. And they found that in religion. Even before Ivan the Terrible came to the throne, during the reign of his grandfather, not his grandfather, I'm sorry, his father, a church official from Russia had written to the Tsar, then Basil III, and said that Russia had a unique mission in the world. It had a spiritual mission. And he said this: there have been two Romes in history. Both have fallen. Russia is the third Rome, or Moscow is the third Rome, and there shall be no fourth. The idea being that the Roman Empire had fallen, the Byzantine Empire had fallen, the great empires of European history. And in the early 16th century, this church leader envisioned that Moscow, the Russians, would fill this mantle, would be the state that would be the next great Christian empire. And for rulers like Ivan the Terrible, look, he looks so nice and friendly, doesn't he? I don't know why he has this name, but no. For rulers like Ivan IV, this became important. I should say this about Ivan IV. He's making a resurgence in Russia today. Ivan IV. His name in Russian, they don't really call him Ivan the Terrible. That's an English adaptation. He's Ivan Grozny. And Grozny it comes from the word for thunder, and it means awesome or awe-inspiring. And I think that's a real key to understanding how Russians identified the source of their legitimacy in the world. Ivan Grozny was awesome. What does that mean? Well, he expanded Russia's borders. He makes Russia this empire from the mid-16th century, an empire that will continue for centuries. How does he do it? He does it through expansion, and he does it through fear and control. Ivan IV vanquished his enemies, real and imagined, with a ferocity that would allow no one to doubt who was in charge, because of the way that he sometimes murdered his own people. To give you an example, before I continue, I should say, there was a town called Novgorod. And the town of Novgorod, under Ivan's rule, Ivan suspected the townspeople of being disloyal to him. So he was involved with a war with a country called Livonia to the west, and he thought that the leaders of Novgorod were going to betray him to Livonia. So what he did is he sent in his armed guards, people called the Streltsy, and they went in and they gathered up thousands of townspeople, and they killed them. And in a brutal way that left no doubt that Ivan wasn't going to put up with any challenges. So some people, what they did is they tied townspeople together. They tied their hands together. And the Streltsy threw them into the water, into the river. Why? The idea being if they were tied together, they would drown. But if any of them were able to resist the forces of being pulled under into the water, the Streltsy stood there with swords and stabbed them. It was a horrific, bloody period, and it wasn't the only example of Ivan's, I would call atrocities towards his people. Because of this, even when Russians in the imperial period and in the Soviet period built monuments to their leaders, present and in the past, Ivan didn't have a monument until 2 years ago. And now Ivan has two. And this is a picture of the monument to Ivan Grozny, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in the Russian city of Oryol. And if you look at this image, right, you won't see any depiction of violence. You won't see any depiction of madness. And by all accounts, Ivan was mad. He actually murdered his son in an argument over his son's pregnant wife, and created a period of time where that led to a civil war because of an uncertain succession. And that image, if anybody is familiar with the Russian painter Repin, he painted this image of Ivan. But there's no madness here. Instead, what do we see? We see a leader on horseback, in control, raising an Orthodox cross. And in this image, right, we see Russian power on display. And we see Russian power on display as the amalgamation of the power that comes not just from the leader, the ruler, the Tsar, but also from religion and the spiritual force that it gives to Russia. Ivan IV is not the only historical figure who is now gaining renewed popularity in Putin's Russia. Ivan IV is popular. Peter the Great is popular. Joseph Stalin is popular after falling out of favor for many years. And the reason is because Russia is a country that is embracing its whole history. If you look at this map of what had been the USSR, you can see that the Russian Federation certainly makes up the biggest part of what had been the USSR, right? It's enormous. But if you look along the periphery, you can see these other states that broke away from the country. These states were important in one way or another. It was nationalism that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin has called the dissolution of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Now, I think there's some other pretty major geopolitical disasters of the 20th century, especially people in Eastern Europe might be able to hearken back to a few. But for him, this was a moment in which Russian prestige took a hit. When Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer in Dresden, he was in East Germany as the Berlin Wall fell, as communism started to crumble. And because he was living in the West and part of the close to the West and part of the KGB, he saw the writing on the wall. His appointment to East Germany came in 1986. And so as a KGB officer, he had access to lots of documents and news reports that were being published not just in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe. And he saw that the Soviet empire was about to crumble. He bemoaned its loss. He bemoaned it, but he was determined that it shouldn't be for naught. What Vladimir Putin has done in the 21st century is he's reinvented Russian nationalism. Even though nationalism was the source of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Putin has created his own nationalism that is the source of Russian power in the 21st century. This source of power in the 21st century often comes at the expense of Putin's neighbors. And I just want to read you one quote that Putin gave. It was in 2012, and the Russians have a State of the Federation address, similar to our State of the Union address. In 2012, Putin had just come back into power. He had been president from 2000 until 2008. And then because the Russian Constitution limited a president's terms of office to 2 consecutive terms of 4 years, he stepped aside, and Dmitry Medvedev became the president, who appointed Putin to be prime minister. And luckily, in a amazing turn of fate, after Medvedev's term was over, Medvedev recommended his prime minister, a guy by the name of Vladimir Putin, to become the next president. And so he does, and in 2012 delivers the State of the Union address. And what he says is this: in order to revive national consciousness, we need to link historical errors and get back to understanding the simple truth that Russia did not begin in 1917, nor did it begin in 1991, but rather that we have a common continuous history that spans over 1,000 years. And we must rely on this history to find the inner strength and purpose needed for our national development. To Putin, Russia is not defined by its current borders. For Putin, Russia is defined by the shared culture, language, and history of the Russian people. Putin's continued references to Russia as a civilization signals a return to a time-honored belief that Russian exceptionalism was rooted not only in Russian ethnic identity, but also in culture and in history. Here we see Putin pictured with the patriarch Kirill. And this image comes from a day called National Unity Day. When I teach my students about history, I especially with Russian history, I tell them that anniversaries are really important. Anniversaries matter a lot. And during the Soviet period, the 2 main holidays of the year were the anniversary of the October Revolution and also the anniversary of the victory over the Germans in World War II. Well, when the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia didn't celebrate 1917 anymore, didn't celebrate the triumph of the Bolsheviks. And as a matter of fact, on the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution in 1917, there was nary a mention, nary a carnation handed out in the streets to commemorate that day. Instead, Russians have developed a new holiday, National Unity Day. And what you may ask is National Unity Day? Well, it's on November 4th. And what this commemorates is the day in 1612 that Russians vanquished Poles from Moscow. In the midst of a civil war that had broken out after Ivan the Terrible's death and Boris Godunov and a few other ups and downs, Russia was in terrible straits. Both the Poles and the Swedes had invaded the country, and Russia was enveloped in a civil war. Poles were in Moscow. But the joint efforts of a common man, a butcher, a good Russian butcher, and a priest, they engaged in a letter writing campaign, and they organized a grassroots movement to vanquish the Poles, which they did on November 4th. And it's this day that's commemorated as National Unity Day. And what we see here in this image is Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, and the Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And the two have developed this very close symbiotic relationship, right? The Russian Orthodox Church has made a tremendous resurgence in the time after the Soviet Union fell apart. ironically, many Russians today, a majority of Russians identify as being Russian Orthodox. Despite that, a significant minority of those who identify as being Russian Orthodox admit to being atheist. So how do we reconcile this? The idea is Russian Orthodoxy becomes a part of culture. It becomes a part of identity. It becomes divorced from actual practice of the church. Because so many people in Russia today identify as being Russian Orthodox, right? The patriarch's embrace and support of Putin feeds into his power, his popularity, and his ability to do what he wants in Russia. And so there is this close relationship. And there is this shared sacred vision of Russian national identity and exceptionalism that is rooted in orthodoxy, in history, and in culture. This image that I have pictured here is the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. This cathedral, when I first went to Moscow in the mid-1990s, this cathedral was under construction. It was being built. And you look at it and say, well, this must be a really old, it looks like an old cathedral. I'm surprised it was just being built. Well, the story is, and this is an actual story, that there had been a cathedral on the same spot before. It was the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. This original cathedral had been put up in 1883, and it was designed to commemorate the Russians' victory over Napoleon in 1812. When the cathedral was unveiled in 1883, it was a big deal. The Tsar and his family rode in carriages down to the opening of the cathedral. Tchaikovsky debuted a musical composition that day that he wrote because he was inspired by this commemoration and this dedication of the cathedral. That composition was a little ditty that we called the 1812 Overture, right? Which if you're ever in Boston on July 4th, you'll hear the Boston Pops. It's what closes out the commemoration. So I just said to you, though, that this is a new cathedral. Well, during the Soviet period, Stalin was annoyed by this cathedral. He could see the domes from his office in the Kremlin, and he resented probably the competition with his power that was coming from this religious icon, and so he ordered it destroyed, blown up, and it was. He had planned to build a horrible monument called the Palace of Soviets to it that was to be topped with this enormous statue of Lenin on top. He ran out of money, however, and he ran out of time because of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. And so this spot that had originally been the home of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was empty. So the Russians did what anyone would expect. What does Moscow need given its climate? It needs the world's largest outdoor swimming pool. Right, so for a time, this spot was the empty hole in the ground that had been created by this explosion became the world's largest outdoor swimming pool. In the 1990s, even before Putin comes to power, right, as the Russian church, after decades of being pushed underground by the Soviets, making a resurgence, right, Yeltsin starts a project to rebuild this cathedral. I went back every summer to Moscow to do research for several years, and it wasn't completed until Putin finally was able to marshal the funds and complete it. He understands that the Russian church is important for his power and his authority. He also understands that territory matters, and that the Russian identity comes as much from its history as it does from ethnic identity. And so what he does is he looks towards ideas of what had formulated the strength of Russia's power in the past. And Putin has this thing called a compatriot policy. And this sounds really nice, right? A compatriot policy. This doesn't sound like anything scary. But the idea is, behind the compatriot policy, that Russians are determined to defend Russian culture and Russian people wherever they may be, even if they are living in other territories. So I have up here a few examples of what we can see as the Russian compatriot policy. In Estonia in 2007, there was a statue to the Soviet soldiers of World War II, and it was going to be moved to the Estonians had no love lost for the Soviets, understandably so. And so it was going to be moved in 2007. And what happened after that was a massive cyber attack, where Estonian banks and computer systems were completely shut down. And who could be responsible? Well, a youth group called Nashi, a Russian youth group, the group that ascribes itself to Putin, admitted the attack. In August 2008, some of you probably remember, there were two breakaway republics of Georgia, and Russia immediately recognized them. In addition, after they recognized them, they sent naval ships to blockade Georgian ports. They bombed Georgian airfields, and they said that they were doing all this as part of this, what will become known as the compatriot policy, because of they were engaged in humanitarian intervention on behalf of Russian separatists, right? For Georgia, for these areas that I almost said Stalin, sorry, that Putin referred to as part of the near abroad, if they identify with Russia, they deserve protection. We see in Kiev, when there are protests in Kiev, in the Maidan, against Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, who was tied to Putin, who was tied to Russia, and his ouster. What happens soon after this whole protracted period that seems like Ukraine's going to have their own revolution? What we see are Russian forces moving into eastern Ukraine, Russia annexing Crimea. And why? Because Putin said that they were doing so to protect Russian minorities who were living in the area. Right? This idea that your identity is not necessarily tied to the territorial border in which you live. And we see this compatriot policy in a very potentially scary way in Ukraine. Putin has recently announced, and you can see on this image, this is eastern Ukraine, where the war between Russia and Ukraine is still going on. Oh, I don't know if you've heard Ukraine's in the news. Okay, but anyway, we won't get into that. But there in Ukraine, over the past few years, since this is all gone, we lose track of this. But this has been a war. 13,000 people have died in eastern Ukraine since 2014 in this battle between Russian forces with their IDs stripped off of them, and Ukrainians who are defending the viability of their territory. Putin has and I will say this, in eastern Ukraine, there's a lot of support for Russia among the inhabitants, and Putin has recently announced that he will start issuing Russian passports to those Ukrainians who are living in this territory. The idea that they can return to the fold of being true Russians because they consider themselves Russian. For Putin, he sees Russian power and influence as being essential to Russian identity. And oftentimes, that power does not end at Russia's borders. If we look here, we can see a couple of seemingly disturbing pictures. Maybe a lot of you remember just over a year ago when there was an attack in Salisbury, England, against a former FSB official in Russia who was living in exile in London or in England. That wasn't the first case. Here we have two images. On the left is a man by the name of Alexander Litvinenko, who had been an FSB officer. FSB was the Russian security force. And what he had done is he was looking into the murder of a journalist in Russia. He believed that it was ordered by Putin, which it probably was. And he was also looking into an incident that had taken place right before Putin came to power in 1999, when Yeltsin had just appointed Putin to be his prime minister. In that time, there had been a series of explosions in apartments in 3 different towns in Russia. And there was one explosion in the town of Ryazan. And there, before the explosion, there were, after a couple of other explosions there in other apartment buildings, people saw a suspicious car and it was impounded. It turned out that the car had materials that seemed to be explosive materials. The car was registered to the FSB, and 2 of the people that were arrested were FSB officers. And it seemed to many that perhaps the explosions that had been taking place were being put on by the Russian government. The reason being that after the explosions that had happened, in which hundreds of people died, I will say, including many Russian military families, Putin, who was the prime minister at the time, used this. He said that he didn't talk about justice in finding the culprits. He said, we will find and destroy the culprits wherever they may be. And the last explosion happened in early September. On October 1st, Russian forces moved in again into Chechnya and started a renewed campaign against Chechen separatists. Litvinenko believed that perhaps Putin and members of the FSB had engineered these series of explosions. And he was looking into it, and he was meeting with some Russians in a very posh London hotel. Soon after this meeting, he got seriously ill. And pictured here on the left is Litvinenko shortly before he died. He had, it turns out, ingested a highly radioactive material in the tea that he had at this meeting. He was poisoned, and after 3 weeks of being ill, he died. And all signs point, including the UK that now believes that the Russians, they have evidence that the Russians did this. On the right-hand side, you will see Viktor Yushchenko, who was a candidate for president in 2004, running against the Russian nominee, if you will. And picture on the left is Yushchenko, when he looks very good looking. He was a very handsome man. And he mentioned that one day, as he was campaigning, he had met with certain security forces, and he came home and he kissed his wife. And his wife said to him, "Your lips taste like metal." Well, pictured on the right is what Yushchenko looked like afterwards. Again, he had ingested radioactive material. These are signs that, like Ivan the Terrible, like Stalin before him, Putin will brook no opposition to what he decides is Russian security. Whether that means that Chechen separatists, real or imagined, have to be handled, whether that means he gets to decide who the leader of Ukraine will be. We hear all the time that Putin's popularity is unparalleled and it's not taking a hit at all. I think there's recent signs that that may not be true, that he may be waning in popularity. He's announced certain pension reforms that aren't popular. There are economic problems. It seems like the only people who are benefiting in Russia under Putin's rule recently are those who are closely tied to him. And so I think what we have to look at is Putin's idea that these challenges are occasions for renewed action to demonstrate Russia's power. If we look at this image here, this is a picture of the Crimean Bridge. And the Crimean Bridge was an engineering marvel that was built and opened in May of 2018 that linked Russia to Crimea. And if you look on the right-hand side, the image I have is Putin shaking hands. It was an event that had great fanfare, and Putin drove a truck across, led the line of trucks across. And when he gets to the other side, and I will say this, if you remember, Crimea he illegally annexed. The source of America's sanctions against Russia stem from the annexation of Crimea. This is a multi-billion-dollar project that he does in the face of sanctions, and I would say it was determinedly so. This was a sign that in spite of sanctions, Russia could do what they wanted. And as he got across, and he gave a speech, and he said this, in different historical epochs, even under the Tsars, people dreamed of building this bridge. And in this speech, as he talked about the fact that for centuries people had dreamed of building this bridge, he invoked leaders of the past. And as invoking leaders of the Russian past, he doesn't invoke Vladimir Lenin. Instead, he invokes Vladimir the Great. Who's the Vladimir the Great? Vladimir the Great was a 10th century prince who converted his country, then known as Rus, to Christianity. And in doing so, Putin claimed that Vladimir united the peoples of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus on the basis of shared culture, civilization, and human values. Right? So he is demonstrating that this is what he sees as important, that Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are one people. And so this understandably has Ukrainians, Belarusians, and many others nervous. Some have suggested that Putin's foreign policy, the Putin foreign policy in 2019 is this. If you are not already a member of the EU and NATO, forget about it. You are in Russia's sphere of influence. And if you are a member of the EU and NATO, that it is in Russia's interest to destabilize, to fragment, to sow division amongst your country, because that will in turn feed his power and authority. And again, from another speech that Putin gives in 2012, I think it's important to look at some of the words out of his own mouth in terms of giving us a sign of where he sees his priorities in the 21st century. He said, in the 21st century, global development is becoming increasingly unequal, which may give rise to new economic, geopolitical, and ethnic conflicts. While in the 21st century, Russia must be a sovereign and influential nation amid a new balance of economic, civilizational, and military forces. It must not only develop with confidence, but also preserve its national and spiritual identity, its sense of national unity. And he went on to say, Russia must not only preserve its geopolitical relevance, it must multiply it. Here's our picture of Yanukovych once more. And Yanukovych, who was the victim of a poisoning by the Kremlin, had a quote in an interview that I think helps tie everything that I've tried to convey today together. He said, moving forward, the biggest challenge for Europe is to come to terms with what he called the medieval policy that Russia follows in the 21st century. And so Russia and Putin's priorities moving forward can be discerned in many ways by their sense of unity, culture, and power that's rooted in Russia's history and culture. So thank you. I'll take any questions if you have them. That sounded depressing. I didn't mean it to be, but.
Thank you for a great morning.
Thank you.
I've always carried around this simplified or maybe simplistic idea that everything about Russia that enchants and obsesses us, on the other hand, exasperates and irritates us, owes to this theory that Russian society never was exposed to the Renaissance or to humanism.
Oh, yeah.
Is that simple-minded or simplistic? You want to disabuse me of it?
I'm going to do nothing of the sort. And this is a really interesting point, that Russia did not experience the Renaissance or the Reformation, right? Because when Vladimir the Great converted Russia to Christianity, it was according to the Eastern Orthodox Rite. And when Byzantium and Constantinople falls in 1453, right? This Russia becomes on its own. It's not tied to the West as other countries are. And so I completely agree. I think it's a very good insight that it develops on its own unique course. And that is a sense of Russian exceptionalism. Now, I will say this, there was a time that was the source of great insecurity for the Russians. There was a thinker, a man by the name of Peter Chadaev, who wrote in the 1830s. And he said, what is Russia? We have contributed nothing to the font of human history. We are a blank slate upon which anything can be written. And he was, the Tsar at the time declared him a madman. By the end of the 19th century, Russia's culture has Dostoevsky and Pushkin and Tolstoy. So that Russian exceptionalism for a time, right, was considered the source of great insecurity. But over the course of the 19th century, Russia's embraced that exceptionalism and marshaled it into great power and authority. So I think your insight is a fabulous one.
Yeah, over here. Hi. This kind of builds on that. What exactly is Russia doing that is exceptional, except for power grabs and chaos? Yeah. I mean, we've at least the Soviet Union had great scientific advancements, first in space and things like that. We see China growing and doing things and inventing things. Over history, we've had other countries contribute to the world, but I'm not hearing anything other than the power as the source of exceptionalism. And is that really building this new empire on a house of straw?
First of all, let me just say the people of Scranton are very intelligent, because these are two of the best questions I've ever gotten at any talk. And the answer to that is, well, one thing they do well is cyber. That is one thing.
But negative, not power.
Negative,
not positive.
No, you're right. And it is Putin uses what's called soft power, right? So in the 21st century, he realizes that militarily, technologically, economically, he doesn't have the same resources to match the countries of the US or a combined EU, so he engages in soft power, which targets not states, but societies and peoples, right? And that's part of the power. But you raise an excellent point that actually I think reinforces the point I'm trying to make. Over the Russian economic growth rate is abysmal. It's been 1%. Estimates are, I mentioned this last night to some people, the estimates are this year it's going to be 0.4%. In research and development, Russia is well behind other countries like India, Brazil. It's falling, and its GDP levels, I think the last stat I saw, and I can't remember what years it was, but it fell from 6th in the world to about 16th now, right? So on the face of it, they don't have anything to marshal to support their exceptionalism. And that's why this idea of going back to this earlier time, creating this mystique and this prestige, arousing populist and nationalist sentiments among its people, is able to hold on. Many are wondering, many Russian political scientists are thinking that Putin's terms will allegedly be up in 2024. And he is 67 now. And there's one political scientist that I talked to once that said, Ari, in 2012, people had only had to deal with him for 12 years. Now people are going to get a little sick of him, right? So I'm not sure that bothers Putin that much. And we have to be clear that this is an authoritarian state. This is not a democracy. And so what he decides will be the priorities are the priorities. And so having this almost smoke and mirrors, I think, serves his purpose. And in a way, that served Khrushchev's purposes.
back in the 60s, right? The whole idea of the Soviets who were not up to economically where the Americans were, they hid it. They faked it. And so I think there's an element of that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just sort of how do they really get forward? Can they continue to really do this?
Yeah.
Especially the Democrats taking everything.
Yeah, my feeling is they can't. And I don't know what's going to happen to my course enrollments when that happens. But I don't think that they can. I believe in research and development. I believe in economic growth. I also believe they have a demographic problem. The numbers of people are declining, and I mentioned this again to some people last night, that I recently read that 25% of Russians surveyed want to leave Russia. And when you look at the figures of those who are under the age of 35, that number shoots up to 40%. There's only so much you can do.
Just a quick point, you mentioned Obama. That was one of his points with the Romney debate, that Russia was very weak economically.
Yeah, he was right. Yeah, so, yeah, oh, sorry.
Are you willing to get involved with the idea that Trump is beholden to Russia and Putin, and that he really believes what he's listening to when he hears the translation, when he's only in the room with Russians?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm afraid I'm going to get lynched, but I'm going to go there anyway. Yes, I do believe that he's let me say this, right? I don't know anything about Trump. I know very little about American government, right? I focus on Russia. But what I do sometimes shake my head at is when American reports focus on whether there could be this economic and political connection between the leaders of Russia and the leaders of America. And my answer is, I don't know about the American situation, but I know how Russians do business. And you cannot extricate political power and economic power in Russia. If you want to do business, or if you want to do business, then you need political loyalty. And if you are in a position of political power, you are benefiting economically. The two are so intertwined that I think it makes a very compelling case that that should there be economic ties between Russia and the United States leaders, that it's thick in both politics, economics, and money, and that engenders a sense of compromise.
Ricky was next.
Okay.
Can you comment on the recent Moscow elections?
Oh, a little bit. I mean, so what happened recently in the Moscow elections was didn't seem to be that great for Putin. Putin's party is a party called United Russia. And in the recent elections, there were people who ran, who were members of United Russia, who didn't run as members of United Russia because it is so unpopular. And things didn't go so well for Kremlin candidates. And the amazing thing is that not just in Moscow, and I should say this, Putin's popularity in Moscow is well below what it is in the rest of the country. But now, September 12th, thereabouts, there were a series of raids across the country in, trying to think how many, I think it was 41 different cities and towns across Russia in which the opposition leaders' offices, opposition candidates' offices were raided. Something like 2,000 people were arrested. And I think that what some people are saying is that this is signaling an erosion of support for Putin and his colleagues, not just in Moscow, but around the country. And that should signal some concern. So I think there's, around the world, we've had recently some, Netanyahu didn't do that well in the elections. Putin's party took a little hit in the election. Boris Johnson is not having a really good couple of weeks. I think yesterday was a rough day for some
some people. And so I think there are signs that this idea of smoke and mirrors behind this authoritarian nationalism might be wearing thin. And that what people really care are economics and bread and butter issues. And that's what you have to generate to move forward.
But you're mentioning countries that have power, where the people have some power. So do you see any light at the end of any tunnel here, that he can't destroy?
Yeah.
It's very frightening.
It is frightening, but there is not a great history of the existence of a civil society and democratic societies in Russia. The one time, and we were talking, Sean Brennan and I were talking about this last night, that there was in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, we had the first ever democratically elected leader of Russia come to power in President Yeltsin. And people put their faith in him. And what did they get? They got rampant hyperinflation. They got horrible corruption. They got oligarchs. They got wars in Chechnya, and they lost their faith in the process. So, since that time, we have had a personality regime, right? This regime subsists on Putin's personality. When he does step aside, and eventually he is mortal, he's good. We hope, right? Yeah. When I talk like this, I have a colleague who says, "Lynn, I don't want to touch your door handles on your office because you worry me when you say these things." But when he is not there anymore, that will be the great test of whether there is enough vitality to fill the void. And Navalny, who is the primary opposition force in Russia, I don't know how he's still alive. I don't know how he's getting away with it. It is a miracle, but his support continues. And I will say this, there's a lot of NGOs in Russia. Now, part of that is, I think there's something like 220,000 participants in NGOs in Russia now, but there are certain NGOs that are permitted and encouraged while others are thwarted. And when you have ties to foreign governments, that's where you tend to run into problems. But it's all, again, that smoke and mirrors of, we're democratic, So.
Lynn, you've talked about the revival of Ivan, Peter, and Stalin in popularity. What is the relevance of Lenin?
That's a great question, and not much. And the reason is this. Lenin was a revolutionary. We can quibble about what Lenin did and how horribly he was a revolutionary. He was an idealist, and as an authoritarian leader, you don't want to celebrate revolutionaries, which is why I think 2017 came and went without much fanfare. I don't know if you know, though, if you go to Russia today, Lenin's still there. He's still under glass. He's still on display in the mausoleum. And some people are surprised that that's the case, and there's been polls done. And the country is split amongst whether they want Lenin to stay, whether they want Lenin to be removed in the near future, or whether they want Lenin gone immediately. And Putin does nothing. Lenin's still there, despite the fact that I think estimates are that it costs almost $250,000 a year to maintain the mausoleum and his body, I guess. And I think that shows that it's better to do nothing. But the revolutionary element of Lenin, despite the fact that when Putin was a child, he read Lenin and was a young pioneer, that's too scary to the 21st century Vladimir Putin. Okay.
Two quick questions. First, do all of the people who live within the boundary of Russia speak one language?
Okay.
And secondly, there must be a system of smaller governments, towns, states, provinces?
Yes.
Yeah. So the answer to your question is no and yes. So there are many languages that are spoken, and at the heyday, it was more than 100 different languages that were spoken within the borders of the territory. I don't know what that figure is now, but there are many. And yes, there are regional governments. There are at the district level, at the what you would consider almost like a provincial level. But the issue becomes that just like in the Soviet period, there is great subordination to Moscow, and so they become a little more than. Putin picked a lot of those people. Even the leader of Chechnya now, the wars in Chechnya settled down, but it's a pretty bad guy who's in power now, but allegedly has fealty to Moscow.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've debunked the liberal apologist reason why all those troubles occur in Eastern Europe, that the West expanded or threatened to expand NATO, and they should have known that Putin would have been defensive, and NATO should have never done that. You seem to indicate he would have done whatever he has done, no matter.
That's a great question. I don't know if that was my intent. So in other words,
it sounded that way.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. That is his intent, right? But his intent is reactive to the expansion of the EU and to NATO. And I will say this: from Russia's geography, I consider to be both the source of its greatest strength and its greatest insecurity. To be 1/6 of the world's landmass with unsecured borders, to the west. George Kennan, after World War II, when he wrote his telegram back to the United States, and he basically said that the Russians' bombastic stance is the source of their insecurity. I would say that Putin's reliance upon this myth of Russian strength, rooted in culture and history, whether it would have happened without NATO expansion, I can't say. But what I can say from the Russian perspective is, as the NATO forces that was formed as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union, as this expands closer and closer into what had been formerly Soviet territory, that seems troubling. And that's one case in which I understand and empathize with the position of Putin and any nervousness that might ensue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I misread you.
Well, I don't think I was clear. Yeah, I could talk for 2 hours. I cut my thing short. Okay. Oops, sorry.
You mentioned Russia's abysmal economic prospects and everything, and my understanding is that the basic source of their economic power right now is, oil and gas. Yep. Are they doing anything to develop their population? I mean, look like Singapore or South Korea or Japan have virtually no resources and they're doing fine. It's not the lack of resources, it's the people. Educate them, train them, motivate them, and I don't see that happening in Russia. Is there anything along those lines?
Not that much, to be frank. I mean, they're not putting the money into research and development, and I would say part of it is because it is an energy dependent. Their economy is so energy dependent. And the sanctions that the U.S. have imposed has actually just, in my opinion, made the oligarchs who reap their money from energy and gas, who are connected to the Kremlin, more devout, more loyal to Putin, because there are so fewer opportunities. It's about money. I mean, the people that have control politically and economically, it benefits them to dump the state's resources into propping up these sources of energy dependence. And without this civil society, without this democratic society, without any checks on Putin's aspirations, it doesn't behoove them to divert resources from those industries into something that would pay off, probably not tomorrow, but 10 or 20 years or 30, 40 years from now.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I want to thank Lynne for being so illuminating and terrifying. I really am scared. Nothing good can, well, you know, he will die, that they say, but I hope that our fear won't prevent us for fighting for good causes, but and be glad that you live in this country and you can do that. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next luncheon, and we look forward to seeing you back here again, Lynne.